Three economic decisions destroyed the Ottoman Empire. Not military defeats, not religious conflict. Three choices about money. The 1875 debt default marked a critical moment in financial history, showcasing how loss of financial sovereignty can set an empire on a path to collapse. But here's what nobody tells you about that default. It wasn't a mistake. It was the inevitable end point of a choice made 22 years earlier. A choice that seemed brilliant at the time. A choice that every financial advisor in Constantinople celebrated. On August 4, 1854, Sultan Abdülmecid I signed a document that would doom his empire. Not a military treaty, not a territorial concession, a loan agreement. 5 million British pounds sterling at 6% interest. The Ottoman Empire, which had conquered Constantinople, ruled the Mediterranean, terrified Vienna, became the first independent state in history to borrow from European capital markets. And once they started, they couldn't stop. But the real question isn't why they borrowed. Every empire borrows. The question is, what happened when they tried to stop? Between 1854 and 1875, the Ottoman Empire took out 15 major foreign loans. 15. 242 million British pounds. That's roughly $1.2 trillion in today's money, adjusted for the size of their economy. By October 1875, debt service consumed 50% of the entire imperial budget. Half. Not for roads, not for armies, not for schools, just interest payments to European banks. The empire's total annual revenue in 1875, 20 million pounds. The annual debt payment due, 10 million pounds. On October 6, 1875, Grand Vizier Mahmud Nadim Pasha stood before the Council of Ministers and said 5 words that changed everything. We cannot pay this year. Not, we will not, cannot. Within 6 months, representatives from Britain, France, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands arrived in Constantinople. Not as diplomats, as creditors. They came with a document. 147 pages. It had a name, the Decree of Muharrem. What it actually was, a receivership agreement. The Ottoman Empire, 6 centuries old, spanning 3 continents, had just entered bankruptcy proceedings. And that's just the beginning. Because the real question is, how does an empire that controlled the spice routes, the Silk Roads, the richest trade networks in the world, end up so desperate for European money that it surrenders its financial sovereignty? Over the next 11 minutes, you're going to see exactly how 3 economic decisions destroyed an empire. The first decision, taking that first foreign loan in 1854. Once they borrowed, there was no way back. The second, the catastrophic attempt to modernize the military and bureaucracy simultaneously, funded entirely by debt. The third, the choice made in 1875 that everyone saw coming, but nobody could prevent. But here's what makes this story matter today. By the end of this video, you're going to see a pattern, a specific sequence that repeats. And when you see it, you're going to recognize it. Because 63 countries right now are spending more than 10% of their government revenue on debt service. 15 of them spend more than 20%. The Ottoman Empire spent 50% before it collapsed. Stay with me. Because the most disturbing part isn't what happened to them. It's how familiar the warning signs feel. Let's go back to 1854. The Crimean War had just started. Russia was pushing south toward the Bosphorus, again. Britain and France, terrified of Russian expansion, rushed to support the Ottomans. But there was a problem. The Ottoman army still fought like it was 1683. Janissary Corps had been disbanded in 1826, yes, but the replacement army was undertrained, under-equipped, and underfunded. The navy was worse. Wooden ships facing the first generation of steam-powered ironclads. Sultan Abdülmecid knew this. His advisors knew this. Everyone knew this. The plan seemed rational enough. Borrow from European banks, modernize the military, win the war, pay everything back from the spoils and resume trade. Clean, simple, logical. The first loan, 5 million pounds from Rothschild and Goldsmith banks. Interest rate 6%. Actual money received after fees and discounts, £4 million. They paid £1 million in fees to borrow £5 million. But it worked. The Crimean War ended in 1856 with an Ottoman victory. Technically, Russia was pushed back. The empire survived. And that's when the trap closed. Because now the empire had proof that borrowing worked. The war was won. The loans could be serviced. European banks were eager to lend more. And the modernization had barely started. Between 1858 and 1874, 14 more loans, each one larger than the last. 1858, £5 million for infrastructure, roads, telegraphs, ports. 1860, $2 million for administrative reform. 1862, $8 million for military expansion. 1865, $6 million to refinance previous loans. Wait, stop there. 1865, just 11 years after the first loan, they were already borrowing new money to pay back old money. This is the moment. This is when the trap becomes visible. But nobody stopped. Why? Because the money was doing something. Constantinople was transforming. Gas streetlights appeared in 1857. Telegraph lines connected the empire by 1861. The first railway, Istanbul to Edirne, opened in 1873. The Galata Bridge was rebuilt in iron. New palaces rose along the Bosphorus. Sultan Abdulaziz, who took the throne in 1861, visited Europe in 1867, the first Ottoman Sultan to ever travel to the West. He saw Paris. He saw London. He saw the Exposition Universelle, and he came home determined to make Constantinople look like Paris. The Dolmabahce Palace, completed in 1856, had cost 5 million gold pounds. 14 tons of gold were used just for the ceilings. 14 tons. The Beylerbey Palace, built for Abdulaziz in 1865, another 2 million gold pounds. But here's what nobody in Constantinople was calculating. The empire's actual productive economy, agriculture, manufacturing, trade, wasn't growing. The money was going to buildings, ceremonies, military parades, visible things, impressive things, not factories, not industrial capacity, not export sectors that could generate revenue to service the debt. By 1870, the Ottoman Empire had borrowed £200 million. Annual government revenue, £18 million. Total debt, more than 11 times annual revenue. For context, when Greece defaulted in 2010, its debt was 1.3 times annual revenue. The Ottomans were 8 times worse. And then, in 1873, something happened that nobody in Constantinople could control. The Vienna Stock Exchange collapsed on May 9th, Black Friday. Within weeks, the panic spread to Berlin, Amsterdam, New York. Banks failed. Credit froze. The Ottoman Empire went to European markets in 1874 for its usual loan. The banks said no. Not "we'll negotiate terms." Not "the interest rate will be higher." No. For the first time in 20 years, the money stopped flowing, and the empire had built a state that required constant borrowing just to function. So what do you do when you've structured your entire government around debt, and the debt stops coming? October 6, 1875. Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha walked into the Council of Ministers with the imperial budget ledger. He opened it to the current year's accounts. Revenue, £20 million. Mandatory expenses, salaries, military, basic administration, £10 million. Debt service due, £10 million. He closed the ledger. We cannot pay this year. Now, remember the question from the beginning. What if 3 economic decisions destroyed the Ottoman Empire? We've seen the first decision, opening the door to foreign loans in 1854. We've seen the second, using borrowed money for visible modernization instead of productive capacity. Here's the third decision. The empire could have defaulted completely, repudiated the debt, told European creditors to come and collect if they dared. They didn't do that. Instead, Sultan Abdulhamid II, who had just taken the throne in August 1876 after his uncle was deposed, made a different choice. He offered partial payment, half of what was owed, a temporary reduction until revenues recovered. The European creditors said no, not because half payment was unacceptable, because they saw an opportunity. On December 20th, 1881, the Decree of Muharrem was signed. Here's what it actually said. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established, a new agency, headquartered in Constantinople, staffed by European financial experts appointed by the creditor nations. This administration was granted direct control over specific Ottoman revenue streams: the tobacco tax, the salt tax, the silk tithe, the spirits tax, the stamp tax, the fisheries tax, 6 major revenue sources removed from Ottoman control and placed under European management. The collected money would go directly to European bondholders. The Ottoman government would receive whatever was left. Let me say that again. The Ottoman Empire no longer controlled its own tax revenue. European bureaucrats sat in offices in Constantinople, collected taxes from Ottoman citizens, and sent the money to London, Paris, and Vienna. The empire had become a tributary state to its own creditors. And here's the part that nobody talks about. It worked. Between 1881 and 1914, the Public Debt Administration collected £251 million. European bondholders received £184 million, a 73% recovery rate. The Ottoman government received £67 million over 33 years, £2 million per year. For context, the empire's annual revenue before the debt crisis was £20 million. They had surrendered 90% of their growth capacity to service old debt. So what happens to an empire that can't invest in itself? By 1900, the Ottoman industrial sector was 3% of GDP. Britain's was 45%. Germany's was 35%. Even Russia, backward agrarian Russia, was at 20%. The Ottoman railway network in 1914, 5,759 kilometers, almost entirely built and owned by European companies who kept the revenue. The Russian railway network, 70,156 kilometers. The empire couldn't build infrastructure because it had no money. It had no money because the infrastructure revenue went to European creditors. It couldn't grow revenue because it couldn't build infrastructure. A perfect trap. And the military, the reason they borrowed in the first place? By 1914, the Ottoman army was still using 1877 model Peabody Martini rifles. The soldiers were still being paid irregularly. The naval fleet was obsolete. When World War I started in 1914, the empire joined the Central Powers not out of strength, but desperation, hoping a German victory would break the debt cycle. Germany lost. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned in 1920. It officially ended on November 1st, 1922. 623 years of history, ended by a debt trap that started with a £5 million loan in 1854. But here's the question that should bother you. Could they have seen it coming? Yes, they saw it coming. In 1874, 1 year before the default, Ottoman Finance Minister Midhat Pasha wrote a memorandum to Sultan Abdulaziz. "We are borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing. This is not sustainable. We must stop." He was ignored. In 1875, the French ambassador in Constantinople sent a dispatch to Paris. "The Ottoman government is insolvent. Default is inevitable within months." Everyone knew, and nobody stopped it. Why? Because stopping meant admitting the previous 20 years were wrong, that all those loans, all that modernization, all those promises to their creditors were a mistake. It would have required defaulting earlier, when the empire still had negotiating power. It would have required telling the public that the palaces, the railways, the gas-lit streets were bought with money they could never repay. So they kept borrowing until the choice was made for them. Now, let's talk about today. As of 2024, global sovereign debt is $307 trillion, global GDP is $105 trillion, debt to GDP ratio 292%. The highest in recorded history. 63 countries spend more than 10% of government revenue on debt service. Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022. Debt service had reached 95% of revenue. Zambia defaulted in 2020, 30% of revenue. Lebanon defaulted in 2020, 35% of revenue. Pakistan is currently spending 40% of revenue on debt payments. Egypt, 38%. Ghana, 32%. And here's where it gets familiar. When Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022, the International Monetary Fund arrived with a restructuring plan. Conditions included tax increases, subsidy cuts, and, this is the key part, external oversight of government revenue collection to ensure debt payments. Sound familiar? The Decree of Muharrem was signed in 1881. The IMF was founded in 1944. Same mechanism, different name. But here's the part that should terrify you. The Ottoman Empire borrowed £242 million over 21 years. The United States borrowed $7.8 trillion between 2020 and 2024, 4 years. U.S. national debt in 2024, $34.5 trillion. Annual federal revenue, $4.9 trillion. Debt service in 2024, $892 billion. That's 18% of revenue. The Ottoman Empire defaulted at 50%. The U.S. is at 18% and rising. Interest rates in 2020, 0.5%. Interest rates in 2024, 5.3%. Every percentage point increase adds $345 billion to annual debt service. If rates stay at 5%, not rise, just stay, U.S. debt service will hit $1.4 trillion by 2030. That's 25% of revenue. Now, the U.S. is not the Ottoman Empire. It has the world's reserve currency. It has the largest economy. It has nuclear weapons. But the Ottoman Empire in 1854 was the 6th largest economy in the world. It controlled the most strategic territory on the planet. It had the 2nd largest army. None of that mattered once the debt spiral started. Because here's the thing about financial sovereignty. You don't lose it in a single dramatic moment. You lose it in 1,000 small compromises. Each loan comes with conditions. Each restructuring comes with oversight. Each bailout comes with reforms written by creditors. Until one day you look up and realize you no longer control your own tax revenue. The Ottoman Empire took 27 years to go from first loan to receivership. How long do we have? So here's what actually happened. 3 decisions that each made the next one inevitable. Borrow to modernize. Borrow to maintain appearances. Borrow to service previous borrowing. Each one seemed rational at the time. Each one was celebrated. Each one was inevitable after the previous one. The Ottoman Empire didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it mortgaged its future to preserve its present. If this pattern concerns you, the next question is obvious. Which empire falls next? We've covered Rome's collapse, the Soviet dissolution, the fall of the British Empire. But there's one collapse we haven't touched yet. And it's the one that might matter most. That video drops next week. If you want to see how other empires made similar mistakes, subscribe. Next week, the Spanish Empire and the silver that destroyed it.